Thank you to the public for attending. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to the Manresa Town Hall, which has made it possible to hold this event, and the COSMÓGRAF series. This is, I think, the 7th. We said that we would devote this to the 2023 agenda, as we did with the other sessions. Welcome also to those who are connecting via the streaming. I haven't prepared any presentation for either of the two speakers. I think they're already presented. Uriel, Manuel, they're in the press. You will know them. Their professions. Uriel is a historian. I remember listening to him in this room talking about history, and Manuel is a philosopher and has worked at the University of Barcelona, and due to different circumstances he's decided to make the step to become a politician. But he does a lot of historical and philosophical thought. We're going to be looking at different points, or as the series is looking at different points of Agenda 2023. And today, point number 17 of these talks about peace, justice, and strong institutions. This is the SDGs of the agenda. You can see that on the UNESCO and UNESCO page. It says the aim is to promote peaceful and inclusive societies in order to achieve sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. And that is what we will be talking about and discussing. I prepared some questions. I'll try and be quick, but first of all, I'd like to just set the scene. Most of the speakers that have come participating in this series have said they want to have hope, and we want to talk about how humanity will get through these crises that we have. This idea has been accepted, but there is a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of agendas to be organized. That's not just the responsibility of the non-governmental organizations, but also the governments. Somebody spoke, or more than one speakers talked about the fact that we're at a civilizational change, and we're not aware of that. Yesterday, we talked about the need for a feminization, or having a feminine perspective on all problems. We've talked about having an integral and inclusive approach, particularly in those countries that are in the north and developed, because we're not just talking about the developed north. Sometimes we are part of the problem with what happens in the south, maybe. There was a discussion on energy issues, and what stayed with me was that we need to apply austerity to resources. We don't have enough energy to develop the levels of consumption that we have, or maintain the levels of consumption we have. Even just with sustainable energy, we couldn't do that. So there needs to be an application of some kind of austerity to our consumption. We have talked about the need for local communities to manage resources, including energy. We've talked about climate change. Perhaps we are all aware of that. We've talked about the climate emergency, which leads to disasters and other problems. Just to give a figure, at the moment, there are more climate refugees than refugees from wars. We've talked about the rough figure of 30 million people who are climate refugees. And finally, a sentence has been repeated, which is, or we adapt, either we adapt and we guide the change, or the change will come over our heads and like a steamroller. So one of the questions is, what do you think, I'm addressing the speakers, is the ability to reach the SDGs or the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030? Well, why don't you go first, Manuel, because you are from the philosophical branch. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for being able to be here. And I like something that you said, which is that, well, I like something about this meeting, which is that we have a historian and a philosopher together. We're both involved in politics, but we have studied the two subjects I mentioned. And I'm very interested in the philosophy of history. So I'm sure we will find fields that we coincide in. Another thing that I like is the idea that you have mentioned. We talk a lot about this, putting the headlights on things and not doing a conjunctural analysis, but think about things in the kind of framework that I've described. We often look very locally and think of, because of our local roots, but we need to be very aware that most of our problems are shared across the whole planet. I don't mean in all of the regions of the planet, obviously, but in some regions. Just to give a couple of examples, we are talking about the reactionary wave. And this is almost affecting the whole world. It's not just a problem here. In the last year, or the last decade rather, one of the key words was populism. Is it Milei in Argentina? Is that his name? Well, one of his battle cries is, the caste is scared. And I thought, oh, I've heard that language. So even the language is shared. That's very important to take into account. So what problems will we have to be able to achieve the goals, the SDGs? Well, this is something I'm very worried about. Our society is going too fast. Society and the world is constantly overtaking us. And this is not an anecdotal problem. It's not an accident. This is structural. And so I think one of the characteristic problems of our period, I'm not saying this is a novelty right now, but I think it's very, very accentuated at the moment, is acceleration, is having to speed up. This thesis is not mine, by the way, but if this is true, this is a structural issue. And the question is not to say, instead of going too fast, we should go slower. No. It's structural. For example, a country, if its production doesn't grow, we say they are in stagnation. But knowledge, what about knowledge? You can't stop knowledge. Do we say, oh, we know enough? No, we need to know more and more and more. I think this is very structured into our society. You have said that we should try and end with optimism, but I am a bit cautious. When I look at the logic in the world, I see a lack of it. I'm concerned about that lack of logic in the world. I think one of the problems in our society is what some sociologists talk about, which is a machine that creates unwanted effects. we're dealing with not what was envisaged, but what wasn't envisaged. And those things create more problems. Okay, of course, the Iceland volcano erupting could be an unexpected problem, of course, but often it is human efforts that are creating unenvisaged effects, and that I think could be the main hindrance to achieving the goals. Well, thank you very much for being here, and thank you to Manuel especially. Sometimes as a historian it's difficult to separate your role as a historian from other roles you have, but I hope to satisfy people's expectations in that regard. Can you just let me start by sharing two anecdotes? Sometimes we've had the feeling that we know enough in history, that everything you can know, we already know. And one of these moments is when it was decided to close the Athens Academy that was founded by Plato. And the moment to close it was when people said, well, everything that you can know, we already know it. So we don't need to have this academy open anymore. And that part of the knowledge is revealed to us through religion, and it doesn't make any sense to have an academy still functioning. Because I don't want you to see this as a response to a particularly local context. We've had that situation in many occasions on many occasions in history. And some of the big physicists in the 20th century said that they went to university and explained that they wanted to study physics, and some of their professors said, you don't need to. Physics, everything that you can know about physics, we already know it. So there's a moment in the 19th century when the perceptions of physicists is that there was nothing left for them to do, and they were encouraged to study chemistry. But we were actually just before two massive changes in science. One was quantum theory and the other was the theory of relativity, the two physics theories. And the history of the West and humankind has been one in which there was a feeling that there was nothing else to study in a particular branch. So I've shared those two anecdotes, which I think are interesting. But let me just share another thought on the problems that we are facing and why these problems produce unexpected responses or apparently new responses. I think part of it is that problems are exceeding the capacity to respond to these by the institutions, for example, national governments or town halls. For example, climate change. There's no government in the world that is able to revert climate change, at least on its own, and maybe not even if all governments did it together, but who knows. But certainly on their own, they're not going to be able to turn that back. What about the consequences of the Ukrainian war or the war between Israel and Palestine? These are conflicts which exceed the capacity or overcome the capacity of governments to do something about them. And so we're seeing a lack of correspondence between the expectations, which are totally rational, that many citizens have for a solution, and what the institutional representatives can do. We all have the problem of climate change, and And citizens say, well, what are the governments doing about it? We've got an energy crisis. What is the government doing about it? And I can't bear the horror of the wars I'm seeing on TV every day and the suffering in the world. And what are the governments doing to sort these problems out? So there's a lack of syntony, or citizens and governments are not in tune with each other, and there's disillusion produced among citizens, or even anger or fear. And this leads to the attempt to find novel responses or new solutions. These could be legitimate or not. Maybe we'll be able to talk about that later when we talk about institutions and strong institutions. But there's this search for new responses, and sometimes the new responses we call populisms. But these responses normally hit institutional blocks because they can't resolve many problems, and that creates new frustrations. There might be an apparently revolutionary response. It could be a groundbreaking one. It could be an unconventional one. But if it doesn't achieve its goals, then that creates new frustration, and then a new response or answer is provided, which could be a traditionalist one that seeks securities around the past. It looks back to history and tries to find responses that seemed solid at the time. And if they seem solid or strong, they'll be taken. There could be reactionary responses. We sometimes call these extreme right or ultra right or far right. So we see new political responses that we hadn't seen for a good part of the 20th century. That helps us understand some of what is happening in the world. Because this feeling of disappointment and frustration and fear, these feelings are there. Some of our society have these feelings and they are seeking alternatives. And the responses often don't provide the solutions they claim. Maybe at some point they could do that, but there may be cases where they do achieve some solutions, but much of society think that the decisions made by institutions until now are not enough and look for alternatives. And there are divisions in society, and we're seeing conflicts between the urban area and the rural area, between the teachers and much of society. There are other disconnections between young people and old people. These are the disconnections that exist. I think it's important in some area to detect the mood, in the broadest sense of the word, of our society. So what is the collective imaginary? But we need to know the mood. That's fundamental. And I think in that regard, the clue that Oriol gives is important. At some moment, we thought that knowledge had reached its end. But I just want to tell a story. So in the 19th century, when there was a theorist in the 19th century who said we would identify the issues which we would never know, and the tract was called Ignoramus. for example, they looked at the structure of matter. Nobody said that that would never be known. There are many moments throughout history when this happens. I think it has something to do with something very, very rooted among human beings, which is a kind of fear of knowledge, which is in our culture. It's in the Western culture. You will be able to remember that Adam and Eve were expelled from paradise because they wanted to eat the fruit of the forbidden tree, which was the tree of the good and bad. Plato said things about writing which seem very close to the things we say about mobile phones. So we hear the same kind of discourse today, that if you go to reading, then you can overcome. So they said the same about reading. If you read too much, you could be damaged. For example, Don Quixote, his brain dried because he read too much. That's what it said in the book. We have the example of Frankenstein. This was the example of developing too much science and it getting out of control. So we want to know, we know more and more and more, but we are a bit scared of knowledge. And it seems like we are discovering that we know a lot, but we don't really understand what is happening. This is an interesting paradox. Ortega said very brilliantly a century ago, we don't know what is happening, and that is what is happening to us. And that is important because, as Oriol said, our reaction to the governments has to do with that. I'm not understanding what is happening, and I want someone to give a response to what is happening. This happened very clearly during the pandemic. There were reactions to science in the era in which I was an MP in Congress. I was working in the education area, and they passed us a report from the middle of the decade on trust that citizens had regarding scientific knowledge. And it was incredible to see because there was a kind of oscillation, but it was around 50%. At times of optimism, maybe 55% believed in scientific knowledge, and at other moments it was 45%. And I thought, wow, in our society, half of the population don't trust science. Something is happening there which is not good. And we're seeing this in COVID. We had people who didn't believe in science and said they didn't want to vaccinate, or they trusted it too much. They said, how can it be that science is not getting vaccines immediately? And they ignored the fact that any medicine had side effects, which of course the vaccines did as well. And a tiny number of people could get coagulation of blood, and everyone got scared about taking the vaccine. But doesn't any medicine have side effects? People feel so vulnerable, and the only place I can trust is science. And science comes and fails, and this has created a collective mood, which I think we have to identify. And this means that there's a certain amount of pessimism. The securities that people had for a long time have disappeared, but science was something that people would hold on to. But now we're seeing that even that, no. Just to follow that thread, it's like as if we were playing football and we're passing the ball between ourselves. I think there's this fear of knowledge. I want to give another example of this, and I want to give an example of the universality of this. It's not just in the Judean Christian tradition, and when there's the expulsion from paradise, it's impossible to be happy if you know things. That's the summary of that tradition. We do find that in the Jewish medieval world, when you had this golem figure, when there's this myth that if somebody was able to create a clay figure, and if they said a sacred word, the word of life, and they wrote it and put it on a piece of paper in the mouth of Golem, then the Golem would take life, would come to life, and that Golem would then rise against its creator. This fear of knowledge we can also find in Greek culture, in the myth of Prometheus, who robbed fire from the gods and took it to humanity so that people could learn to do things with fire. They could do ceramics, they could do meteorology and other things, and cooking. And there was the story was that his liver would be delivered to the gods for eternity as a punishment for taking that fire. So all of these, and including Frankenstein, are stories with the same theme. Just while a volcano in Iceland is about to explode, do you know about that? Do you know that Frankenstein, the book, was written because of a volcano? Do you know this story? In 1817, the Tambora volcano in Indonesia exploded, and crops were lost for 2 years. It was a terrible cold. And the Shelley family and a friend who was a doctor, before because it was so cold, they said, what should we do? It came to the summer. They had a lot of money, British with a lot of money, and they decided to go and spend their holidays in Switzerland. When they reached Switzerland, they found that there was this terrible cold that they couldn't that stopped them from leaving the house because it was so cold. They didn't even want to leave the house, couldn't be bothered. They sat in front of the fire, and they gave each other a challenge to tell a story and write it down. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, and Polidori wrote Dracula. They were written at the same time, in the same house. Did you know that? You see? Sometimes volcanoes inspire people. Fear of knowledge scares us, but at the same time, we want it to give us security. We don't manage securities, we manage uncertainties. Somebody has mentioned that Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, I don't know if I should talk about this in front of a philosopher, but the father of contemporary philosophy, a key figure in philosophy, because he takes British empiricism and French rationalism and merges them together and creates the foundations for philosophy. Kant said, intelligence of people is measured by the amount and intensity of uncertainties that they are able to handle. And we are now faced with an infinity of uncertainties. Okay, yeah, okay. Uncertainties. And we want certainties. And we want science to give us certainties, but sometimes science can't do that. Well, I just want to say something, but try and be brief, because we're taking up a lot of the time just on this one question. This is true. This is a perception that there is. We are in an era. I think the word that defines this period is uncertainty. And I think there's this feeling that we all have of being very vulnerable. Some are vulnerable in many senses, or more senses. People think about what is happening to me and what could happen. This feeling has a lot to do with people's mood in society and the expectations that people have. I remember that a colleague of yours in Argentina, when I was in Rosario in Argentina, and they said that everybody, when they travel, they go with all sorts of protections and an umbrella. They know when they go there, they know what health provisions I can have, or rights I have. I go with insurance, I go with vaccines, I have everything. Business relationships today have a lot of guarantees. But imagine how things were in the 17th century. Imagine this is what would happen. You would send goods to another country and you'd hope to receive the money back. I don't know if I'm explaining that very well, but I think you can understand. And what we need to add is that our expectations have changed. It's true that we live in a society of fear, but we've internalized fear. And this means that our expectations, particularly if we compare with other periods in history, or let me give you another example. For different and academic and publishing reasons, I've gone to Argentina a lot. And the stories about Argentina are incredible. The conditions that people emigrated to Argentina were incredible. People from a small village in Asturias or Galicia would be put on a boat. I'm talking about the older child, who 14 years old, would say goodbye to their family, and the family would know that they would never see their child again. They would be put on a boat at the age of 14 or 15 or 16. I was told of stories in a funny way, but it's pretty terrible, the background to it. So this was a guy who much of the emigration that ended up in Uruguay ended there because the boat went past Buenos Aires in Argentina, and people on the boat didn't know when they had to get off the boat, and the boat would continue after going to Buenos Aires to Uruguay, and the people on the boat would be told, this is the end of the journey, you need to get off here. That's how they ended up living there. And people will be sent to Argentina and they'd say, look, this is how you do what you do when you get there. You have to find the family. You need to get off the boat, go to the left. There's a building with a special shape and ask for Paco there. At the other side of the world, they would be sent. And now we have an enormous mattress or cushion in all senses. So something has happened to our society that we've become inoculated to know all of the supports that we have, and we are frustrated, and our uncertainty affects us. I do. Can I make a provocation? I know you want to stop us because of the time, but I'm not a good professional, because the TV professional would have said, no, you can't speak now because of time. I know. No, I just want to say one thing. Fear has a subjective aspect. It's a very powerful sense or feeling. Fear is an instrument to allow us to survive. If we didn't have any kind of fear, we would be in risky situations constantly. Our chances of survival would be lower. So fear is very powerful because it's connected to the most strongest instincts we have, not just as humans, but in the whole of our evolution that has happened. It's a very powerful feeling, and it's subjective. The same person faced with the same situation would be scared, or one person faced with one situation would be scared and the other faced with that situation would not. And frustration is also subjective. We are a society that perhaps, because of the increase in our material conditions over time, because we've developed these sedentary societies over millennia and how infant mortality has increased, we had 600 out of 1,000 children used to die, and now it's under 2 in every 1,000. So because of the increase in material conditions of life, then we expect more. And here is the provocation. Some of this lack of tolerance of uncertainty comes from us inoculating to, or telling our children and our grandchildren in our families and in our schools that, perhaps with all the good intentions of in the world, we want them to be happy. So we inoculate them against, or vaccinate them against the evils of the world, or keep them protected from that. And we sometimes forget that some happiness is subjective, and it's very difficult to be eternally and constantly and universally happy, because you often are happy in contrast with something. Normally you are happy because you've overcome something. And trying to get happiness to be universal and eternal is perhaps a bit mistaken, because happiness is subjective. It doesn't get rid of our responsibility to try and respond to our conditions in the best way possible, and to try and improve our conditions. Is that the provocation? Well, then it's acceptable. And I want to ask these questions, and then I'll keep you short, because I want you to comment on the data in the report, talking about the world situation. The world is changing, which was produced a few days ago. So I'll ask you about that later, but I want to ask you 3 or 4 questions. The first is, problems are going quicker than our capacity to respond to them, and sometimes they're unexpected. I think you have talked about how the unexpected part is because of a human factor. So it could be immigration, not just war and other issues that are more obvious. The second one is, to get peace and justice, we need strong institutions, but strong institutions. But it said for a time, there was Santiago Alba has said that not just our institutions and society liquid, but they're gaseous. So what do we mean by solid or strong institutions? The other questions that I'm interested in, Oriol, you must know this because you are a walking archive. There's been these reports that have been published recently about the quality of life of democracy, show that democracy is regressing. In many countries, democracy is nothing valid. It's not a way of living, and countries in which theoretically we have democracy has qualitatively declined. That is the case in many European countries. And there is another model which many characters are looking towards, which is autocracy. Marina Garcés says part of the blame for that is that politicians haven't done their work, because they promise things but they don't commit to them, because we are partitocracies. People go from parties to have good jobs in companies, This is what she says in her book, Un Monde Commun. She says what a politician says in the campaign, it doesn't mean anything. It is just a wet letter. No, but you already know that not all politicians are the same. Well, that was another provocation. And what kind of leaderships do we need? That's the other question. The book Alors Carbonel talks about 10 things that should be done at these moments. One, I think it's the seventh of the 10, is the issue of leaderships. And he says that current leaderships are not useful to lead, but are covering or preventing all of the changes that need to be made. And that we need to do a new start or a clean slate in order to develop the leaderships we want. Whether this can be from a vertical or a horizontal perspective. So we're not just talking about political leaderships here. We're talking about economic leaderships, etc., etc. At the moment, the big problem that is stopping us from advancing is we have these people who are supposed to be leading us but are not actually leading. They're just leading themselves. I'm mentioning the text. Wow, we could be here for many weeks responding to these questions. So solid or strong institutions, the word in Catalan is solidas. In English, it is strong. That's the translator speaking. And now back to the speakers. The UN and international law is supposed to look after our interests, but it has been ignored in the recent conflict we've seen with the attacks on the Palestinians. So what do you say about that? Okay, let me see if I can do an evil thing. I always try and do this, but it never happens well. In the US, Eisenhower, the Republican president, he had been the chief commander on the Western Front in the Second World War. He was one of the 4 generals in the US history who has 5 stars. So he was a general, he was a chief commander of the Western forces, and then became president of the United States. He was in power for 8 years. He did 2 terms just before he handed over to President Kennedy. Eisenhower said goodbye to the nation. He did so with a speech in which he denounced the existence of a structure or a power lobby that was made up of the political class and the administration and the army and those who produced weapons. He said that democracy is under threat. He said it is under threat of a pressure group where you have these big industrialists, where you have these big media representatives who know, and the unelected officers of the administration who of course nobody had voted for. People forgot this speech, but it's a speech which is very, very troubling to read today because of its relevance to today. In today's world, there is another coalition of power which is made up of politicians and senior judges and the owners of the media and journalists, which has as an objective to maintain the status quo and wants to keep debates to be on the same problems as always and to never escape the loop that never closes. They never want to think about other issues, and that's why it's so hard to talk about education or universities or certain housing rights or tenants' rights or the precarious worker, because these issues are not part of the interests of those who set the agenda. Whether this is true or not, I think it's clear that whenever there's any change, there are those who want to ensure that they will still have the privileges that they've had until then. Change is well received by some people who hope that change will improve their lives, but change is always badly received by those who have had power until then, because it can shake their power. And I think that the powerful at any moment are those that think that change will not allow them to continue to be powerful. And they don't, if they're less powerful, of course, people aren't scared of change because it will make them more powerful. But those who are more powerful, they will try and shield themselves from change. We have seen that when we saw part of the old oligarchies decided to oppose democratic changes and economic changes through violence on the street. This has happened with the totalitarian regimes, such as fascism. And at the beginning of the 21st century, we can see how part of these power structures is trying to stop changes using another instrument, which is not going onto the street, although, well, at the moment we are seeing a lot of people going onto the street, but through this power structure, which is less democratic within the division of powers. There are parts of power which have to have inevitably relations with democracy. For example, the legislative power of some link it does have with democracy because people vote for it. Governments are voted by parliaments and parliaments are elected. But there's other power branches which have less of a link with democracy, which is the legal or judiciary. In many countries, judges are not elected democratically. In some places they are. And so this becomes a kind of guarantee and ability to resist changes by the old powers that be. If anyone falls into the temptation to use that to stop democratic changes, this is sometimes called lawfare, which is using the legal system to stop political changes. And this we've seen in Brazil with President Lula da Silva. We've seen this in Colombia when the current president, Petros, was removed as mayor of Bogota. I'm kind of presenting this as a kind of question, so it's not clear what I think happened in Ecuador, or it's possibly happened in Argentina. But we've also seen it here, and how the judiciary has intervened to stop processes. Some people think that this is a good thing, others think it's a bad thing. It depends on whether they believe in the change. Some people don't like the change too much, and others think differently. The fact that it's happening in so many places at the same time, maybe that's not a coincidence. Maybe it responds to the fact that the change wave, or the wave of change, and the reactionary wave are very spread out geographically, and that there is an explicit will or strategy to respond in that way to change. And the fact that for decades of the Western history, nobody thought about assaulting or storming Capitolio and the centers of power, and we're seeing the assault of the Tres Poderes Square in Brasilia, and that someone might want to go to the Congress in Madrid, and maybe it's not a coincidence that these acts and these desires are being expressed today. We are seeing a phenomena which goes beyond our immediate world. We are facing a phenomenon which has more global aspects. And I think if we see that, that can help us better face the challenges we have ahead of us. Well, I wanted to say another thing. You head wherever you want to head. I tend to do that. I don't want to use very, very local examples. We did say that we wanted to not talk about culture, not talk about the very local experience. But someone came up with the term judicial partner, and one of the person who came up with that idea was Cristina Fernandez, who actually was involved in some spectacular levels of corruption, and her defense was that there's this legal party that is operating against me. I don't want to take a position on the exact reality of that, but we need to be careful, because if anybody can say, but I'm being attacked because I have some public links. If I commit a crime, if that happens, I can then defend myself with the umbrella. Well, yeah, of course, I agree with that. Whenever a judge doesn't abuse their professional role. Yes, but I just want to respond to something you said, because I've come across this a lot. Talking about politicians, I don't know if you've found this. You've had a stronger political commitment. I'm sure they must have asked you the typical question. You come from an intellectual world. How come you're in politics? This question comes up with me all the time. People assume you, who come from an intellectual world, this political world where there's all this conspiration and stabbing in the back and hindrances. How do you see that? Well, I tell you, the stabbing in the back in parliamentary groups is just is child's play compared with the stabbings in the back that I've seen in university departments. Okay, I can confirm that. I was having lunch with a friend of myself, with Caral, and he said, "Whoa, what about in corporations, the stabbing in the back? Wow, I can't even tell you about that." That's how he responded. So we're in a moment. There's still not there's no longer something called public opinion, but if there is one, there's this stereotype of so-called politicians are like a scapegoat. They are the concentration of all the evils in society, which frees everybody else of responsibility, and those that aren't politicians, they're safe from suspicion. And I think this does a lot of damage to politics. I'm from a period in history when leaderships was not it's not a word that we liked. We don't like the word, because now we've been through a decade. I won't say the word selling, but there's been the transmitting of the idea that the new leaderships and new politicians and new whatever is a positive thing. And leadership, as Rubalcaba said about the right to decide, he said that this is an unbeatable slogan. How can you fight against that? How can you fight in the same way? How can you fight against new leaderships? Because the opposite of new leaderships is old leaderships, and we always assume that new is almost the same as good, and old is almost the same as bad. But we need to think about that. I've said this in writing. I don't have to repeat it now. But when I went into the Congress of Deputies in Madrid in 2017, some of the things that they were saying in the plenaries of Congress were totally the same, word by word, with the things that I felt in the faculty when I was a student. I was a student between 68 and 73. And I could hear exactly the same words. I'd probably even said those words. And I'm thinking, what is happening here? Is it so important? Is leadership so important? Is this leadership so new? I have a lot of reservations. I remember when Xavier Domènech left politics, and everyone was surprised. And he said, "We need new faces." And I looked at him. He's 40. I thought you're 40 years old. What, we get fed up with faces after people get to 40? I think we need to. Unfortunately, a lot of the time behind this discourse of new leaderships is this idea of using the expression "quítate tú que lo ponga yo," let me take over your place. I agree with your intervention. What we need to achieve is not adhesion to new leaderships, but trust in the institutions. I think that's much more important for me than this apparent renovation, which often, and I'll end with this, and this is to do with what you said, people who are asking for new leaderships is those who don't understand politics as a public service, but as a spectacle. They say we need new faces. What? So the spectacle continues, not to do things in a better way. I'll try and do short questions so you can respond with more time, and I would like you to also respond with shorter answers so we don't eat up all of the time. Or just invite us to come more often. Is there any question here from anyone? From the audience? You'll have to use the microphone for those connecting via streaming. One of the words in the title for the session is alliances. I don't know if you can say something about the importance of alliances in the world we are going into now. Since 1980 to 2023, real wages have been the same. However, productivity has massively increased. In 1980, we didn't have computers. In 1980, the town hall of Girona only had one typewriter, just one electric typewriter. I was told that by your councillor Joaquim Nadal today. Productivity has massively increased, but real wages has stayed the same. The difference between productivity and real wages, who ends up with that in their hands? Who appropriates that? This is a very relevant question. There are several possible answers, and it depends on different places, but clearly there's not an equitable distribution of income. Part of this productivity, or part of the wealth that is being created, is staying in the hands of the financial system. And part of it is staying in the hands of the electricity companies. The other day, some news was given that 100 family incomes have increased by 35% in a year. If this was the such, that means they're doubling their assets every year and a half. How many of us here in the room have had our assets increased by 2 in a year and a half? I don't know if you've ever had a doubling of your assets. Have we? So there are real big imbalances in our society. And now I'm going to link it with the previous thought. And one way of avoiding that this non-balanced distribution stays the same is to attack politics. So a way of defending this status quo is to attack politics. Because in the media world, they know that none of you can win in terms of earnings and money. Altogether, you can't win. But there is an area where altogether you have, or we have, a lot more force than the others, the minority, the elites, and that is in politics. If all of this is true, Western societies, not just ours, need a new model of alliances, which addresses wage earners and self-employed persons and business people. In Catalonia, there is an enormous country called Celsa. It was the biggest steel company in Catalonia, which for a year it had to close during the day shifts in the summer because it couldn't pay its electric bills. That company is the victim of a system in the same way that many vulnerable families are, or at least in a similar way. Josep Urguet, who's here, I've seen you, says we need an alliance with the productive sectors against the speculative sectors. We need an alliance between the sectors that create wealth through their work and efforts and invest their resources against those who gain profits not doing that. Or either we are able to create those alliances or it will be difficult that we'll move forward. We can build ourselves through those alliances and the privileged know that these alliances are threats to them and threats to their privileges. There was a moment in the 20th century when US capitalism generated enormous companies such as Standard Oil, which earn enormous amounts of money, and a fourth power developed, which was the press. And the press labeled them as the robber barons, the barons of the economy that won money or earned money, robbing from most of the society. And this led to pressure by society and voters to bring in legislation against monopolies. And they split up the company into 50 companies. That's practically impossible today, because now economic power would say, or did decide, that this shouldn't happen again. And they decided to buy the media themselves. And now many media outlets, or many, I don't know if all of them, but many of them are the property of the same companies who obtain enormous profits while the real wages of the immense majority of the population are stuck at the same levels as 1980. Another question, is there anybody else who wants to ask something? No? Nobody? So maybe you could jump in. Yeah, just one thing. What I'm saying is very connected to the situation of democracies at the moment. It's true that at the end of the last century, particularly from 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, and when a group of democratic societies joined, and we can see an increase in the amount of countries which are formally democratic, but that's starting to fall, the number of democratic countries. But also within countries which are historically democratic, we can see a disillusionment with democracy. There was a survey done in Germany that showed a certain percentage, an important percentage, not of people who vote for AFP, but people who AFD, sorry, but people who vote for the Socialists or CD or the Christian Democrats who didn't believe in democracy anymore. And what Oriol was saying is that if democracy is losing attractiveness and appeal, it's because I think there's a certain awareness that politics has become trivialized and become a spectacle. Whether people believe in conspiracy theories or no, but they understand that power is somewhere else, or at least power is not completely where it should be. And I think it's definitely worth recovering, if the word exists, to re-dignify politics precisely as a means that we need, and for politics to become a useful tool again. I know there's many people that don't see democracy in the same way, but I'm hearing things that shock me. We hear people express views which are like such. There's a lot of arguing about politics as if they were talking about football. People get involved in that, but what people think is politics won't really change anything. And I think that's a very harmful vision of politics. And we're seeing very, very deep disillusionment in society, which needs to be fought. And we must do that by regenerating the public arena. The public arena, this is a well-known paradox, which is two pillars which tradition, I know there's been a lot of changes, but two pillars that have been basic pillars for democracy, which is the political forces and the media. The paradox is that often those pillars are internally undemocratic. This leads us to a troublesome or troubling phenomena. How can it be that we don't know who has shares in a newspaper in Madrid that's very, very involved in political debates? Often as voters, we see that there's a change in ownership of a newspaper and the editorial line completely shifts. Those owners have all the right to change their editorial line, but they should explain it to us they should explain to us that change has happened, and they don't. So I think that's a dysfunction. This isn't a big discrepancy with what you have said, Oriol, but I think at the moment the traditional public arena, i.e. the media, etc., and the political institutions, it's not that they're very partisan, but I think this has been deactivated. Its role has been deactivated. Public opinion does not exist anymore. It's totally pulverized to such an extent. Okay, maybe I'm exaggerating a little here, but if there were newspaper kiosks selling newspapers today, based on the logic that we have today, people would go to the kiosk and say, are these newspapers talking about the same country, or are they talking about different countries? Because often the reality that they put on their front page and the problem that they're highlighting is completely different to the other newspapers. I think we're heading towards a complete lack of public opinion. You mentioned something that's important. There was a book that was written in the 2000s, but I think is still relevant, which is called Republica.com or Republic.com by Cass Sunstein, who, by the way, is an ex of Martha Nussbaum. If you're interested in this philosophical gossip, she's a philosopher. And he talked about what were the expectations at the end of the last century regarding internet. People thought it was going to be a big agora, a big global agora. And what has actually happened? He talked about and used an expression which is very much of his period, but you can completely understand. He said, what we're seeing with internet is a cyber balkanization. So there are agoras to fit each person. So we don't have a public debate. We don't have a full agora involving everybody. Supposedly deliberative democracy is not deliberating at all. The media are instruments or mechanisms to give people the belief that they are right, but never to lead them to question their opinion. Is there a question there? Do you have the microphone? Can you hear me? Good afternoon. For a time, with regards to this disillusionment with traditional politics and these disillusions that we've been seeing, for a while I've been thinking that one of the problems I can notice in my milieu is that the general population, and I'm talking about young people, but adults and people that have been living in this system for a while, we don't know anything about how politics works and how the parties work, and particularly how the institutions work. And I think that's one of the reasons, or the root of some of the main problems, because people don't understand the institutions that govern us, and because they're incapable of understanding them, they don't understand why they're not providing the solutions that we want. And I think that they're not moving forward enough in that regard. There's a polarization of politics, and social networks are taking things to the extreme more and more. I don't see many signs of hope, because I don't see how schools and institutions or the media are working to revert these current problems with regards to the future. I don't know what you think about that. One way of answering that, according to the line that Manuel has mentioned, is that the social networks fraction public opinion. Everybody looks for their bias of or their ideas to be confirmed. They want to be proved right, and they only go into the social media and only interact with those who think like them, or even people who think have a more harder stance than them on issues, but that broadly agree. So let's give an example. Imagine he thinks that something is a light vermilion, and I think it's a dark pink. From a long way away, you would say, well, you see things pretty similarly. But imagine that he goes and interacts with those who believe it's vermilion and say it's vermilion, it's dark vermilion, and they encourage him in that way. He's looking for confirmation, and he ends up believing it's now dark vermilion, or even burgundy. It's almost black. And I'm interacting with people next to me who are saying, no, it's a light pink, it's a light pink. It's very pallid, it's almost white. And after a while, he will be trapped thinking it's black, and I will be thinking it's white, and we'll end up having a collision rather than enjoying consensus. So I think the media or the social media is fragmenting public opinion. I don't know whether that parallelism will convince you, but I ask the question, how can it be that before European societies built these big cathedrals? Here in Manresa, you have the only one in the world that doesn't have a bishop. Cathedrals have to have a bishop, but you have one without, because you thought that having a cathedral, and you decided it didn't work having a bishop, so you had one without. But it's a spectacular building. And how is it that before European cities created these cathedrals, and now if you talk to the local government of Manresa and you ask to build a building like that, they say, how would you fund that? They'd say it would be impossible. But the reason is because there were big convictions to build a cathedral, and now there are different opinions. And part of what happens is that we're lacking these big convictions. These human communities and human societies that have been able to create great things are those that are most able to share interests and material things, and have also shared something else. They've also shared an ideal. They have shared a desire in whatever field it might be. It could be cultural, political, or religious, or whatever. And this has given that extra in order, and the extra and managed to mobilize extra involvement to do something more than look after your well-being and leave something for the future generations. When Pericles proposed a program to invest with public money to create the Parthenon, most of the Athenians said, "Nah, this costs a lot of money. Come on, Pericles, we have to pay for theatres and we'll have to get Phidias hired, and just leave it. Just let's worry about other things." Now, this is what they say. Maybe it's not totally true, but they say that Pericles went in front of the Agora, the big parliament, in front of all the citizens and the heads of family, and proposed an ambitious cultural program. He said, "I know many of you won't share this belief and you'll be against. I understand. That's not a problem. If need be, I will fund it myself. And the glory that generation in the future will give us will all be for me." And then the assembly changed opinion and everybody decided to fund it, because the idea that the future generations would give glory to whoever built this would actually push them to make decisions that went beyond looking after their economic well-being and their concrete needs. So often societies are able to build big collective projects when they are capable to share. And that's not easy to improvise, but we know it can be done. Very quickly, I totally agree with everything that Oriol has mentioned. I just want to mention things on a more practical level. We're talking about fragmentation. Fragmentation is also among the media. It's a fragmentation among the routes of information. And we're also seeing generational fragmentation. There was a time when people of my age, when our children didn't come to the sitting room to watch TV, but stayed on their computer, and that they got information through their computer. And the first time someone said to me, no, I find information through Twitter. And I said, what, you get information from Twitter? Twitter is substituting the format of a newspaper? Well, yes, that was the case. So the media to get information has changed, and this has led to a generational fragmentation, which is very important. And you think that the mental universe in which a certain generation is in has nothing to do with the mental universe of people of another age group. I will confess that sometimes I see the headlines in the TV news. They always have a happier story at the end. Somebody is presenting their latest record. And I thought it was the first record because I didn't even know who this group is. But it must be important because the news are talking about that. I didn't even know they existed. And I'm a person who I think is intervening in the cultural world, but I'm missing all sorts of information. And the opposite happens. This didn't always happen. Not so long ago, we used to have shared cultural reference points. My parents didn't like the Rolling Stones or the Beatles, but they knew that they existed. They knew what they were. They knew who Sabina was. But now I don't know about these certain figures in the world of show business. I don't even know who they are. So information has become fragmented, and suddenly you have to find out about things. So it's necessary to know what is the only field which we can understand is universable, that is education. It's the one area where we can avoid fragmentation. We've talked about this a lot. Today, it is still necessary for there to be a subject. We can put the name, we can give it the name we want, but something about education for citizenship, education for political participation. We can put whatever name to it. But you can think that you're addressing to, through that you could address all children, or all young people. If there's something difficult like Pericles had, with difficult political problems, yeah, there can always be obstacles. But I remember that famous declaration by a Harvard chancellor who said at some point, he said, yeah, I know, he was proposing educational changes, and people responded saying it's very expensive. Yeah, and it's very complicated. And he said, yeah, it's complicated and it's expensive, but the alternative is ignorance, and that's much worse. The only good there is knowledge, and the only evil is ignorance. That's my view. I think we're missing these. If we had these reference points and we shared all these, then things would be a lot easier. So we're going to say goodbye to the people who are here in the room and those who are connected by streaming. We have the Agora space if you want to go in there and share your opinion about these sessions, and you can fill in the questionnaire that's there. Does the questionnaire affect whether we're invited to come back? No, don't worry, that's guaranteed already. We'll be back. Good night.